The Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took down 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. The Good Samaritan is one of those stories we learn pretty early on growing up in church. And it's so common that many times it's even referred to outside of church. So even if you didn't grow up in church, you've probably heard of the Good Samaritan. We often focus on the Good Samaritan in this story, especially since it's the commonly used title to refer to it. However, this week in a clergy Bible study, we were discussing some of the other people present in this story. I have never really looked at this story from the perspective of the person lying for dead on the side of the road. We often take time to think about how those we expect better of, like the priest and the Levite, just pass by. And we applaud the Samaritan who shows mercy to the man who was robbed. But we don't usually focus on the man himself. People from Samaria would have been despised by Jewish people during this time, and vice versa. These 2 groups did not get along. They did not see eye to eye, and they certainly did not help one another. So for the man lying on the side of the road, who we understand to be Jewish, and the listeners of this story would definitely know that, they would expect that this person, the Samaritan person, would just continue to walk by too. And that the person lying there would rather be left for dead than be helped by an enemy. The Samaritan, seeing his enemy lying for dead, and instead of passing by on the other side, like everyone else in the story, as we know, helps his enemy. Jesus really had the attention of his listeners at this point. So I want us to take a second to really recognize how powerful this is. Take a second to think about someone or a group of people who you would consider your worst enemy. Someone that maybe you dislike so much that you would rather be left for dead than helped to survive. That might feel a little drastic, but I know that all of us here have had dislikes, maybe even to the phrase of enemy, of people in our lives at some point or another. So take a second. Think about how that person or this group makes you feel. How just thinking about them upsets you. Now, think about them helping you. bringing you to safety, risking their own life and safety, and then using their own money and resources to help you heal. Wow. Given these feelings and emotions that we just conjured up, we can understand a little more personally how powerful this story truly was to those hearing it. Our society tends to separate people to create an even deeper divide. We are to separate emotions and feelings from logic and practical action. We are taught to just ignore our feelings or the experiences of those around us and just keep going. Don't stop to look in the eyes of someone begging for money in the park. Don't listen when someone you disagree with says that they are in pain and hurting by the actions that you caused or the actions of the wider world. Don't talk about difficult topics for fear of upsetting someone, or even worse, having to actually talk and process what is causing the pain. This is what society teaches us. The more we live into this, the deeper our division and separation become for one another. To go against the grain is risky. The Samaritan was physically risking his life to stop and help this other person. It was dangerous to travel back then. The robbers, that was literally their livelihood. That happened on a regular basis. We don't necessarily think about that when we hear this story, but that's kind of a part of the cultural norm that we didn't really know as well. So he went against the grain. And when we are vulnerable and we share a piece of ourselves with another person, we might not know how it's going to be received. And the Samaritan didn't know if the man who was robbed would heal and survive, but he used his resources anyway. He showed compassion and love for a person he would have despised, not knowing if it would make any bit of difference. He bridged the gap between logic and emotion. Society wants to keep us separated through division. It's easy to make assumptions about another person and their life when we don't even know them. And how often do we do this? When we see someone in need of food or gas or a place to sleep, do we make assumptions about them, how they must do drugs, or maybe they gambled away all their money, or whatever they did to get themselves in this position? It must be all their fault. Instead of getting to know someone and hear their story of how they lost their job because the company they worked for downsized, and then they no longer had medical insurance, and so when their child got sick and had to spend 3 days in the hospital, they didn't have any more savings to pay for their mortgage or buy groceries, and then after some time they lost their house. Or maybe they grew up in an abusive household and never had anyone in their life to support them as a child, and so the only way they could survive was out in the streets. And then the job that they were able to get didn't even provide a living wage. And so the cycle of poverty just continued. These types of stories are the reality of so many people. It wasn't just one thing that happened to them that got them to the place they are today. It was a host of things, including a society that isn't built on compassion and understanding, and it isn't willing to change to support the marginalized. And that is where we come in. The Samaritan could have easily continued on his way. The man who was robbed could have just as easily told the Samaritan to leave him be, out of disgust for his personhood. But instead, compassion was given and healing began to occur. And Jesus told this story to teach us to go and do likewise. So as followers of Jesus, we are asked to show compassion, even when it goes against our nature, which is programmed in us by society. We are to help provide healing, and that is where compassion begins. When we recognize the humanity and divinity of each person, whether they are homeless or rich, whether we despise them or they are our best friend, we can begin to bring healing to a world so desperately in need of it. So next time you see someone in need, instead of assuming you know their entire story, try compassion and healing and see what happens. Amen.